God and Science by John W. Dawley. Copyrighted by the John W. Dawley Trust. Narrated by Michael Drew. Chapter 10. Joseph. The story of Joseph used as a link. The story of Joseph probably ranks as one of the best known of the Bible, for it's a colourful narrative, full of action and interest. Joseph is sold into Egypt by his brothers, who are jealous of him. But he makes good in Egypt, and finally becomes so important an official in the court that in time of famine his brethren have to come to him in order to buy corn. Eventually his entire family joins him in Egypt and settles in the land of Goshen. Some authorities on the scriptures consider that this saga, which consists of a series of well-known Eastern tales, was introduced by the prophetic writers merely as a link between two different theories of Jewish history. One theory was that the main body of Hebrews settled in Canaan permanently and never left it, and that only a few of them ever went down into Egypt. The other theory was that the main body of the Hebrews went down into Egypt and were eventually brought out by Moses, and that therefore the real history of the Hebrews as a nation began at the time of Moses. With these two theories is bound up the important question as to when the Hebrews first began to know God as Yahweh. One theory held that God had always been known as Yahweh, and the other theory that it was Moses who first introduced the name Yahweh to the Hebrew people. As the Clarendon Bible states, this story provides an explanation for the Hebrew tradition of a sojourn in Egypt, and serves as a link between the cycle of sagas belonging to the early period of Hebrew settlement in Canaan and the cycle of sagas which have Moses for their central figure, thus unifying two divergent traditions concerning the call of Israel. The Joseph saga has little confirmation from Egyptian or other history, but as a symbolic illustration of the divine system of salvation it is of the greatest importance, and when understood in this way it will be loved and cherished even more than before. Joseph's coat of many colours. Joseph was Jacob's favourite son, and the story begins in Genesis 37. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colours. The prophetic writers of these narratives were inspired men who regarded spiritual reality as all-important, and who, as we have seen, were primarily interested not in facts of history, but in the development of the spiritual idea. Surely, then, this coat of many colours must have had more significance to them than a mere garment, for it figures prominently in the early part of the story. If the premise of this book is true, and the seed plot of the Bible is contained in the story of the 7 days of creation, or Revelation, then it would certainly be natural that if Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children, he would, above all else, have desired to give him some understanding of this story. Certainly, if the author of this book wanted to bless someone he loved, or to bless mankind, he could think of no greater gift to confer than an understanding of the pure and perfect system of metaphysics as revealed in the Scriptures. In the story of Noah, as the reader will recall, the rainbow, with its 7 colours, was employed as a symbol to betoken man's eternal covenant with God, the way man can agree or find himself at one with God, through an ordered and intelligent understanding of the 7 days of creation. May not Joseph's coat of many colours have been a similar symbol of these spiritual tones or root notions of reality? It's very natural to suppose that Jacob would give to Joseph some understanding of the divine system as outlined in the first chapter of Genesis. The details of this metaphysical system may not have been specifically recorded at that period, but it is evident that it was always the basis of inspired thought and idea, although perhaps unconsciously so. Joseph's brethren were jealous of him. His understanding of pure spiritual reality through the days of creation became the target for envy and ridicule, as the ability to understand and prove God has often been. They regarded him as a dreamer. In his youth Joseph had 2 important dreams, which indicated the dominion that must come with the gaining of spiritual sense. This was the birthright of dominion over material sense, which Jacob had struggled to gain from the start, and now Joseph was glimpsing it. His second dream is recorded as follows: "And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me." Genesis 37:9. It seems that Joseph not only had a coat of many colours, some understanding of the days of creation, but he also glimpsed the spiritual power which must come from the utilization of these symbols of spiritual thought and enlightenment operating in perfect system, as had already been symbolized by the sun, the moon, and the stars on the 4th day of creation. "And they hated him yet the more for his dreams, and for his words." Genesis 37:8. Abraham and Jacob had to deal with a Lot, an Esau, and a Laban. But Joseph had to deal with his brethren, who tried every conceivable method to destroy Joseph and his vision, as the testimony of the physical senses often tries to do to each one of us when we awaken to spiritual demands. Eventually they stripped him of his coat, his spiritual understanding, and finally succeeded in selling him into bondage in Egypt and convincing Jacob that he was destroyed. The question might be asked today, has not mankind, in failing to see the deep significance of the seed plot of the Bible in Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2:3, unwittingly stripped it of all that would give it life and being, even as Joseph's brethren robbed him of his coat of many colours? One of the striking details of this story of Joseph is the unwillingness of Jacob over a long period to recognize that Joseph's state of thought had not been destroyed and was still operative. Which of us has not had this whole experience ourselves, or witnessed it with those we love, when mortal sense testimony seems to have stripped us of our developing spiritual sense, and to have tried to convince the Jacob in us, which fathered that spiritual sense, that our vision is gone? Moreover, is not this the condition in the world today? Materialistic theories seem to have driven hope and vision down into the depths of despair and darkness, and to have mesmerized numberless men and women into thinking that their spiritual ideals are not practical. But the divine plan of the one infinite cause is forever operating irresistibly, and although humanity, trying to reason from both a spiritual and a material basis, may temporarily make its bed in hell, eventually the Christ idea, God's eternal idea of himself and of all that is true, will be found forever available, practical, and provable to spiritual consciousness. Consequently, even in Egypt, Joseph began to prove his understanding of pure metaphysics, which had originated with the development of the ordered days of creation or revelation, symbolized by his coat of many colors. He rose quickly to prominence, and was soon put in charge of all affairs of the house of Potiphar, the captain of the guard. Egypt stands for the mental condition of paganism, materialism, and mysticism. Every one of us at some time or other is sold into Egypt, and there we have to prove our spiritual values or sink. Just so with humanity as a whole. Joseph in prison. In the last chapter it was seen that Jacob's blessing on Joseph, Genesis 49:22 through 26, indicated that he was to manifest a great measure of motherhood and true womanhood, and immediately upon his arrival in Egypt he had to express these very spiritual qualities. The first temptation which came to him was symbolized by the attempt of Potiphar's wife to seduce him, that is, to entice him from his exalted sense of true womanhood, that state of thought which brings forth abundantly the fruit of the Spirit and of purity. Many great lives and wonderful opportunities have been wrecked by some wife of Potiphar, when there has not been enough of the right idea of true womanhood and motherhood to deal with sex. Joseph's vision, however, was equal to the occasion. although his way out seemed to be through prison. But many of humanity's greatest achievements have originated in what at first appeared to be a prison, and sometimes what seemed to be a tomb. Though a tomb only to a false mortal sense of existence, and never a tomb to spiritual sense, which always rises from it. As we rise in thought, we certainly bury the mortal, but not the immortal, for that cannot ever be buried. Joseph's ability to analyze and expose the errors of the human mind was most marked, for had he not been given in his early days a coat of many colours? He was now beginning to see how he could utilize his understanding of the sevenfold nature of divinity by right application to the human problem, and this eventually culminated in the ability to feed and succour his 10 brethren, to protect and nourish even the human sense of things. Whilst in prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of 2 of his fellow prisoners, Pharaoh's butler and chief baker. The butler dreamed that he was again pressing wine from the grapes into Pharaoh's cup, but the baker dreamed that the fowls of the air were eating the royal bake-meats out of the basket which he bore on his head. Joseph told the butler that his dream signified that he would be restored to his former office. In other words, Joseph saw that the wine of inspiration always exalts and restores. He told the baker that his dream signified that he would be hung. In other words, he saw that the desires of the flesh are exposed to every preying thought and inevitably perish. Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph's developing spiritual sense and ability to translate spiritual reality later enabled him to be called forth from prison to interpret Pharaoh's 2 dreams, of 7 thin kine eating up 7 fat kine, and 7 thin ears of corn consuming 7 fat ears of corn. Joseph interpreted these dreams as a prophecy that there would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine in the land. But what Joseph really saw was that the desolating action of the complete gamut of mortality will, unless forestalled, destroy for each one of us the divine system or calculus made manifest through the 7 days of creation. Joseph not only interpreted the dream to Pharaoh, but also revealed the remedy. And that remedy for each of us is to ponder ceaselessly and preserve in our thinking, through science and system, the ideas of reality, so that in times of temptation and disaster we shall be able to deal with the situation, whatever it may be. The 7 well-favoured kine of Pharaoh's dream represent the spiritual understanding and full use of the sevenfold nature of God, as symbolized by the days of creation. So do the 7 good ears of corn. On the other hand, the 7 lean-fleshed kine and the 7 thin ears of corn are symbols of the whole range of materiality and its disastrous effects. From this point onwards, Pharaoh respected and valued Joseph and made him ruler over all Egypt. The practical import of the biblical narratives. At this juncture, let us touch upon the practical import of all that we have so far considered. Once our reason and our spiritual sense have led us to accept the fact that there is an exact science of being in the Bible, vast possibilities open up to us of using this compilation as a textbook of life. Faced with an unhappy situation, which just seems to flood our whole experience, we can turn to the story of Noah, and through an understanding of the divine root notions of reality presented in that story, we can work our way out of that situation logically, certainly, and with confidence and dominion. Faced with the temptation to desert our ideal, to believe that it will not accomplish what we hoped, we can follow the certain journey of Abraham to the fulfillment of his ideal and purpose. Struggling with ill health or with some tenacious sin, we can identify ourselves with the ordered overcoming of such evils by pondering Jacob's struggle. If we find ourselves in a position from which there seems to be no escape, or in the depths of despair, what comfort to know that there is a way out, and that we can utilize that way today just as effectively as Joseph did to work his way out of a pit and a prison. These are just a few instances, but there is no problem in human experience of which the spiritual solution cannot be found in the Bible. The practical use of all these scriptural symbols, however, is dependent on understanding the ordered numerals of infinity and their operation in a divine calculus. Otherwise, the Bible is just a record of more or less historical incidents, helpful in outward example, but of little practical use without an understanding of the divine principle involved. The ordered way to a comprehension of this principle must necessarily be found at the beginning of our scriptural textbook, and that is exactly what the author of this book has tried to show. When will we cease from attaching a merely personal significance to the inspired figures of history, and realize that they were great only as they conformed in thought and character to the infinite and divine design of pure reality? Jesus said, "The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works." The Infinite One is forever expressing itself as one divine design, one infinite calculus of spiritual ideas, and every now and then some great thinker rises above the delusive conclusions of the physical senses and conforms in thought to the divine standard. This is a practical possibility for every one of us, and without this possibility of individual and universal attainment, there could be no basis for at-one-ment with divinity or with science, as neither of these is a respecter of persons, but only of intelligence and of inspired effort. Benjamin, indispensable in uniting the 10 brethren to Joseph. To return to the story of Joseph. Joseph's idealism had now begun to translate the Pharaoh sense of things out of paganism and despotism into a good human concept which recognized some measure of the value of the spiritual. That is what each one of us must do in our own individual experience. If we truly understand the definite nature of God as the one divine identity and as infinite soul, this will transform our material sense of existence into a higher sense, where the value of spiritual idealism is recognized and good human belief becomes our servant. Joseph was now ready not only to forestall the famine of spiritual sense, but also to support and protect his father and his brethren, all that had formerly fathered his vision and all that would have destroyed it. The story is told that in the time of famine Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, and so he sent 10 of his sons to buy corn there. But Benjamin he kept behind, because he was his youngest son, and he feared for him. In Egypt it was to Joseph that his brothers had to appeal, but they were not able to recognize him, for they thought that they had disposed of him. Spiritual sense can never be quenched, however. Joseph would not give them all the corn they wanted unless they went back and brought their youngest brother with them. In working out his difficulties with the 10 brethren, the symbol of the operation of truth in the flesh, Joseph realized that the Benjamin state of thought was indispensable. As was indicated in chapter 9 of this book, Benjamin represented the ability to give up a mortal sense of things and to enjoy the comfort and consolation resulting from the spiritual sense of things. Joseph saw that without Benjamin, without the laying aside of mortal beliefs and the acceptance of the spiritual as the only, there could never be a sense of true spiritual government and its demonstration in human experience, as symbolized by the 12 brethren. But he also realized that no demand for penalty or belief in the necessity of suffering must be introduced into divine metaphysics. Jesus certainly illustrated to men the way of overcoming through tears and triumph, but he also pointed consistently to a higher way, the way of science, the way of pure spiritual values, analyzing, uncovering, and annihilating every vestige of evil. He made this clear when he stated, "I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine, until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Jesus suffered because of the blindness of men to spiritual things. If they'd been willing to believe and understand what he was trying to teach them, he would not have had to undergo persecution and finally crucifixion. But he had to prove to them the indestructible and permanent nature of spiritual reality in this way, for unless they had had physical proof of it, they would not have been convinced. Salvation always comes either through suffering or through scientific and spiritual understanding. What wonderful results we should witness if we determined that it should always be through the latter. When at length the brothers brought Benjamin, Joseph, through the symbol of hiding the cup of suffering, in Benjamin's sack, exposed the error of believing that the laying aside of mortal sense must necessarily involve suffering, retribution, and punishment. Also, by returning his brothers' money in the mouths of their sacks, Joseph symbolized that human processes get back just what they bring. Joseph was, in fact, lifting the idea of salvation and demonstration above that limited sense of the application to the human, the 10, which believes in suffering and penalty, a cup of sacrifice. He was lifting it into the realm of pure metaphysics, where exact spiritual values dissipate so-called material values with the ease and certainty with which facts in mathematics correct mistakes. Only one who understood such a system of metaphysics could have said to the woman taken in adultery, "Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more," or to the palsied man, "Thy sins be forgiven thee," because such a system recognizes spiritual values alone as fundamental. In the light of divine metaphysics, as understood and practiced Christianly and scientifically by Jesus, sin, disease, and death are seen as errors of the human mind, to be corrected as such through divine fact. Naturally, those who believe in the reality of both spirit and matter, of both good and evil, must always pay the price of human progress, and that price is pain and penalty. Jesus' mission paved the way for a higher process of salvation. No longer is such an experience as his necessary or desirable, or his sacrifice would have been in vain. The master metaphysician triumphed over mortality with its cruel penalties, and opened the door wide for future generations to overcome through grace and not through suffering. Hence his dynamic pronouncement for all time, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." John, in Revelation, foretells this scientific way of salvation when he describes the state of thought symbolized by the city foursquare. The divine infinite calculus of pure Christianity and science, where there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. It is hideous to teach men of a God who demands suffering. Sin and materiality punish themselves, as mistakes in any subject punish themselves. Jesus' statement, "I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly," still comes ringing down the ages, and when men understand the science of spiritual reality and its eternal availability, the outworn notion of a cruel God will be thrown onto the rubbish heap of obsolete theological doctrines. Humanity finds for itself more than enough pain and penalty as a result of its ignorance and materiality. What it needs is the scientific and Christian way out of these things, not the way of suffering. Moreover, it is evident that the coming generation is not any longer prepared to accept outmoded theories of a cruel God and of hellfire in this or any other life. Joseph is a wonderful symbol of how to attain, through inspiration and understanding, the true proof of spiritual government. As symbolized by the 12, this does away with every belief of penalty and suffering. Joseph blessed his brethren. He did not condemn them. He provided and cared for them. They did not have to suffer for their mistakes, once they obeyed the spiritual sense, as typified by Joseph. The state of consciousness symbolized by the 12 is brought into operation as men understand the ideas of the threefold essential nature of God as infinite life, infinite truth, and infinite love, operating in a four-dimensional calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science. In human salvation, we may first have the 10, the application of sevenfold truth to the human through analysis, exposure, and annihilation of error, but we must eventually rise to the 12, the demonstration of pure spiritual values, the proof of scientific fact in divine metaphysics. So the Joseph saga indicates there must be a complete 12 of spiritual government and proof, symbolized in that age by the sons of Jacob, and symbolized later by the 12 apostles and the 12 gates of the city foursquare. In the case of the 12 sons of Jacob, it was seen that Benjamin was indispensable, as portraying the passing away of the cup of suffering, and the loveliness of accepting and recognizing the blessings of divine grace. The spiritual significance of the story of Joseph. What a glorious symbol is the story of Joseph, a symbol of spiritual fact to be understood and used in the eternal now of reality. Surely the Christian and scientific symbolization of eternal spiritual facts and their intelligent application is of far greater value to men than a mere historical record, rightly regarded as being unreliable and inaccurate in many of its statements. The inspired scriptural writers were much more than casual historians. They were revealing to mankind, in the most definite way, the infinite ideas of reality and their eternal availability. The fact that they began the Bible with the symbol of the 7 days of creation and their intelligent operation in a perfect system should indicate to us the primary importance they attached to that symbol. It's interesting that in dealing with the Egyptians in the time of famine, that is, in dealing with materialistic and impoverished human thought, Joseph made it render all things to Pharaoh, to an improved sense of good human idealism, and he did this through 3 stages of thought: the physical, the moral, and the spiritual. First, he made the Egyptians render to Pharaoh their money, a symbol of the grossly physical, then their cattle, a symbol of the moral, and finally their land and their bodies, thus leaving nothing to them but the spiritual and mental. If Joseph had actually made the Egyptians render to Pharaoh all their money, cattle, land, and also their bodies, he would have been a monster of cruelty, and he would have had no rightful place in the scriptural record except as a symbol of gross inhumanity. But if, on the other hand, the Joseph saga is a symbol to illustrate to men and women in all ages how the understanding of the spiritual idea can be protected and nourished against all eventualities, and how it can intelligently and scientifically overcome the merely physical, both for the individual and for humanity as a whole, then it is one of the outstanding spiritual symbols of the Bible. Moreover, this symbol of the definiteness and identity of God's nature as soul, which gives safety and which translates jealousy, hatred, and despotism into some sense of the rule of soul, is as indispensable to each one of us as the knowledge of any fundamental fact in mathematics, music, or engineering would be to the success of the student of those subjects. The Joseph saga is a vast, beautiful, and compound symbol for all eternity, illustrating the possibility of knowing and proving God as infinite soul, and thus letting the dry land of the 3rd day appear, and bring forth grass, the word of God, illustrated by the coat of many colours, the herb yielding seed, the Christ idea translating the sense of famine, represented by the 7 lean years, into the bountiful provision of spiritual sense, and the fruit tree yielding fruit, Christianity, illustrated by the blessing Joseph finally bestowed on his brethren. The story of Joseph also shows how, through the 7 days of creation, or numerals of infinity, operating in a divine four-dimensional calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity and science, we can meet and master every phase of materiality, and so inherit here and now some measure of the dignity and well-being of the sons of God. Its priceless spiritual lesson prepared the way for Moses to lead the children of Israel out of the bondage of Egypt and into the freedom of spiritual enlightenment. This understanding of God as soul, the one and only identity, forever identifying all things with itself, enables us to appreciate and use the definite sense of God's fatherhood as symbolized by Abraham, the definite sense of development and spiritual translation as symbolized by Jacob, and the definite sense of ever-present salvation from sin and from every temptation of Egypt as symbolized by Joseph.